All right, as you guys know, we are approaching the end of the school year, and we still have some stuff that we need to cover in biology. So we are officially in crunch time. We need to cover parts of chapters 14 through 16 in the next 6 days. So each day we're going to do a little bit of notes, and it's basically picking out some of the main topics of the chapters, right? Some really important things that you need to know. This first video is essentially covering section 2 of chapter 14 on community interactions, because there's a few definitions that we need to make sure that we have in our notes so that we can do well on our test at the end of this. So there's a few things here: competition, predation, symbiosis. Starting off, we need to know that there are two different kinds of competition. We know what competition is, but there's a difference between inter-specific competition and intra-specific competition. Right? The competition that you normally think about when you're playing in a basketball game, one-on-one or whatever it is almost always intra-specific competition, because you have two individuals of the same species that are competing over something, whatever it is, right? You might just be trying to win that game to 7 in basketball, but in the real world, remember, when two organisms are competing, it's life or death. They either get those resources or they don't. But sometimes individuals of the same species will compete. In other cases, they're individuals from different species that are competing. So I need you to know the difference between one and the other. Inter, with the ER at the end, is for different species competing. So if you have a rabbit and a deer that are both trying to eat the same plants, right, they're in competition with each other, versus intra-specific competition. If you have two gorillas that live in the same part of the jungle, they have to have a certain amount of resources. They're going to compete over them. So know the difference. Otherwise, predation, not really a big deal. Predator, prey, you guys know enough about that stuff. But symbiosis, right, we are going to have to add a little bit to that. Make sure you know that that is when you have two species, right, and they'd be different species that are in a close relationship with one another. So we've kind of talked about this before with coevolution, but there are 3 specific types of symbiosis. Right? It can either be a mutualistic situation, it can be mutualism, and that's a scenario where both species benefit. So I'm going to put a plus for both because they both gain something out of this scenario. So this is the one, like when we were talking about it being a flower. Right? The bee benefits because it gets food, it gets the nectar, and pollen, whereas the flower benefits because the bee's helping it reproduce. It's helping it to pollinate from one plant to the next. So they both gain out of this situation, so it's mutualistic. And besides mutualism, there's also commensalism. And commensalism, I usually represent like this, a plus and a neutral, right? Because one of the species is actually going to gain something out of the relationship. The other species doesn't get anything out of it, but it doesn't get hurt by the relationship. So it's really just neutral. It doesn't care, doesn't hurt it, doesn't help it. It's happening. And it doesn't matter one way or the other. So when you have a bird that's nesting in a tree, generally speaking, the tree doesn't care that the bird's there. It doesn't hurt it, doesn't help it, but the bird gains something out of that. It gets protection, shelter from that tree. So that's an example of commensalism. And then finally, you can also have parasitism. If it's a parasitic relationship, you guys should know, right? One thing's gaining, the other thing's actually being hurt, right? So one species gets something out of the relationship, something positive for it. The other species is hurt by that. And this is a pretty easy example to come up with. You guys know some parasites, but one specific example, we could use a mosquito and any kind of animal. Right? That mosquito is gaining because it gets its food, it sucks the blood of that animal, whereas the animal is actually losing blood to that mosquito. So obviously it's not helping it, it's hurting it. Plus those mosquitoes tend to spread diseases too. So lots of different problems with this. But if one's gaining, the other one's losing, that's parasitism. So again, know the two different kinds of competition, intra-specific, just know if it's different species competing or the same species. And then three different types of symbiosis. It can be mutualistic, where they both gain. It can be commensalism, where one gains, the other one doesn't really care. And then the third scenario, it can be parasitism. One gains, the other one loses. You guys can tell the difference.